At my wife's memorial, my son set a bowl of dog food in front of me in the middle of a room full of guests and laughed coldly, saying, "This is what freeloaders eat." Everyone erupted out laughing as he recorded it to post online. I didn't say a word. I simply packed my belongings and quietly left my own house that night. But the next morning, when all of his bank cards were suddenly blocked and the police started knocking on the door, he finally understood that the freeloader old man he mocked the night before would become the most costly mistake of his life. Hello everyone, welcome to the story. Before we continue, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Quick note, this is a fictional story and some details are dramatized to make the narrative more engaging and provide meaningful, useful reflections. Any similarities are purely coincidental. The sharp rhythmic thud of a bass line didn't only wake me. It vibrated through the floorboards and into my very marrow, shaking the dust off the framed photo of Elena on my nightstand. Silus Vance, a 68-year-old retired forensic accountant who spent 4 decades tracing shadows and ledgers, woke up to a nightmare in the very house I built in the Arcadia neighborhood of Phoenix, Arizona. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as the confusion of sleep clawed at my mind. I fumbled for my glasses, my fingers trembling in the dry 78 degrees heat that never truly left the desert, even in mid-November. Today was November 15, 2024. It was the 6th anniversary of the day I lost Elena, the day my world had gone silent. But my home was not quiet. It was screaming. I pulled on my robe, the fabric feeling like a shroud, and stepped into the hallway. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer and expensive vaporizers, a chemical fog that had no business in my sanctuary. Below the music swelled a vulgar electronic pulse that felt like a physical assault. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate desecration of Elena's memorial on the very day my grief should have been a hallowed ground. As I reached the landing, the scale of the betrayal crystallized. My living room was a sea of strangers' faces blurred by colored lights and a lack of respect. My son, Rhett Vance, 34, and wearing a designer watch I'd unknowingly paid for, stood at the center of the chaos with a look of pure, unfiltered contempt. Beside him stood Ivy Sterling, a 31-year-old fitness manager, who treated my kitchen like her personal stage, and my grief like an inconvenience. They were filming their phones held aloft like digital torches. The sight of Elena's hand-carved memorial altar being used as a coaster for a cheap beer can felt like a physical blade sliding between my ribs. The delicate lace she had sewn for the 6th anniversary remembrance. The small porcelain bird she loved. The handwritten recipe cards from her mother. It was all shoved into a dark corner to make room for a makeshift bar. "Rhett, what have you done to your mother's memorial?" I asked, but my voice was a ghost in the roar of the music. He didn't even look at me at first. He just continued playing to the camera, laughing as Ivy poured a vibrant blue liquid into a glass resting directly on my wife's memorial photograph. "Relax, Silus." He finally shouted, his voice cutting through the bass. "We're finally putting this sad little museum to good use. Mom's been dead 6 years. Time to move on." The laughter from the crowd was a jagged edge that cut deeper than any blade. I moved toward the altar, my legs feeling heavy and old in the Phoenix heat. Then came the clatter. Cold, metallic, final. Rhett reached behind the bar and pulled out a rusted, dented metal dog bowl, the same bowl that had once belonged to Max, our golden retriever. The sound of it hitting the polished oak of the dining table silenced the room more effectively than any plea I could have made. He cracked open a can of cheap wet food, the iron-rich stench of it instantly turning my stomach. He dumped the gelatinous brown mass into the bowl with a sickening squelch. "This is what freeloaders eat, Silus," he said, leaning in so the phone could capture the cruelty in his eyes. "In our house, everyone earns their keep." Even on Mom's precious Memorial Day, the word hour hung in the air like a poisoned mist, thick with a new and terrifying reality. I looked down at the brown gelatinous mass in the metal bowl. Then up at my son's phone, the lens capturing my shame for 1,000 strangers to see. I didn't explode. I didn't shout. Rage, I've found, is a liquid that freezes solid if you give it enough cold air. And in that Phoenix dining room, the temperature had just hit absolute zero. The lens of my son's smartphone remained fixed on me, a glass eye, hungry for a collapse that would never come. 20 people held their breath, waiting for the old man to shatter, to weep, or to beg for a dignity that had already been stripped away on the 6th anniversary of Elena's death. I looked at the gelatinous mass in the rusted metal bowl and then looked directly at Rhett. My hands did not shake. I reached down and picked up the bowl. The metal was cold, biting into my skin with an abrasive texture. "Thank you for the reminder, Rhett," I said, my voice as dry and precise as a tax audit. Ivy Sterling let out a sharp laugh that died quickly when she saw I wasn't flinching. I scanned the room, making eye contact with the neighbors I had known for decades. Most looked away, but in their silence, I read the narrative Rhett had been weaving. I wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. I was the freeloader, the senile burden occupying a $650,000 Phoenix home my son claimed to own. I turned toward the stairs, the weight of Max's bowl anchored in my palms. Each step felt like a border crossing a slow ascent away from the vulgarity below. Behind me, the techno music kicked back in, but the sounds were muffled, distant. When I reached my bedroom, I closed the door and turned the cold brass lock. The click was the most honest sound I had heard all day. I walked to the nightstand and placed the bowl beside Elena's unfinished knitting and the memorial candle I'd planned to light. The metallic clang echoed through my grief. As I looked closer, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't just any dish. It was Max's bowl. Max, our golden retriever, had died 2 years ago from what Rhett called a sudden illness while I was at a conference in Tucson. Looking at the deep rust and claw marks, I saw the truth of a slow, thirsty neglect. It was a message. This is what happens to things no longer useful in this house. For a forensic accountant, an insult is just a data point. And I was starting to see the most expensive pattern of my life. I cleared my desk, creating a clinical workspace. I looked at the dog bowl, mentally categorizing the legal infractions of the day and the desecration of Elena's memorial. How many times had I ignored the warning signs, hoping things would correct themselves? I thought about the herbal tea Rhett insisted I drink before my early nap. I am a man of habit, rarely prone to 12-hour bouts of unconsciousness. I suspect the brew carried more than chamomile. I reached for the laptop, the blue glow reflecting in my glasses. The memorial party was theirs for the night, but the numbers were mine. The spreadsheet cells flickered into existence, a grid of empty white boxes, waiting for the truth. I'd spent 2 years pretending I couldn't see. The soft hum of the laptop fan was a lonely mechanical companion in the dark. A stark contrast to the distant muffled beat of the music downstairs that was finally fading into a weary silence. My palms felt cold against the aluminum casing of the laptop. As I logged into my secondary Chase account, I discovered immediately that Rhett didn't just borrow the card. He had actually changed the billing address to a P.O. box in town to prevent me from seeing the paper statements for the last year. It was a calculated move to keep me in the dark while he bled me dry. Row 1, Category Theft. Amount $1,200. I typed the entry with a dry click of the keyboard keys. That was just today's damaged premium liquor and high-end catering for a party I was never invited to. All siphoned from my savings. I felt a clinical hollow satisfaction as the first row of data solidified on the screen. The eye strain from the bright white background began to set in. But I didn't stop. I scrolled back through 6 months of grocery bills, cross-referencing them with my own meager pantry. While I had been eating canned soup and day-old bread from the discount rack, the accounts showed purchases of Wagyu steak, organic imports, and vintage wines I never tasted. Logging these numbers felt like performing an autopsy on my own bank account, finding the parasites still fat and warm in the tissue. I pulled up Ivy's public social media profile on my phone, the screen glowing alongside my laptop. There she was, month after month, hosting elaborate dinner parties in my dining room, smiling over plates of food I had unknowingly paid for. The smell of the cold metal dog bowl still lingered on the nightstand, a metallic tang that sharpened my focus. I moved on to the utility bills, looking for the source of the persistent hum I'd noticed coming from the basement. I found it in the electricity spikes. Rhett had been running industrial-grade servers for a crypto mining venture that he told me was just extra ventilation for the house. The electricity bill had doubled in a year, thousands of dollars siphoned directly from my pension account to power his digital vanity project. He wasn't just living here. He was consuming the house from the inside out, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. Then I saw it, the health management charge. My blood turned to ice water, a recurring monthly payment of $400 to a company I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a supplemental insurance policy I'd forgotten, but the policy number didn't match any of my records. I dug deeper into the digital transaction trail, my breath hitching as the truth revealed itself. It wasn't insurance for my health. It was a life insurance policy Rhett had taken out on me. He had listed himself as the sole beneficiary of $400 a month bet that I wouldn't see another winter. The realization hit me harder than the dog bowl ever could. My son wasn't just waiting for me to fade away into the fog he'd created. He was actively investing in my exploration. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was betting on it. Abandoned the sanctuary of my locked bedroom, slipping through the shadows of the hallway like a ghost in my own Phoenix house, heading for the one place where Rhett never dared to snoop, my old home office. The floorboards didn't groan beneath my slippers despite the dry Arizona climate. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, complicit in my quiet rebellion. My mind was a forensic storm reeling from the discovery of that life insurance policy and the desecration of Elena's memorial just hours before. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was betting on it with a $400 monthly premium. But a bet requires a certain degree of control over the outcome. And I was beginning to understand exactly how he planned to tilt the odds. To my horror, I discovered that the insurance wasn't the only ghost in my medical files. A pharmacy statement from August 2024 showed a prescription for Benadryl specifically. Dihydramine hydrochloride in 50-gram doses billed to my secondary insurance card through a CVS pharmacy here in Phoenix. It had been prescribed to me by a doctor I have never met, likely through a telehealth loophole where a voice and a stolen social security number are enough to secure a chemical leash. Someone had been impersonating me to obtain a weapon to use against me, exploiting Arizona's relaxed telehealth regulations. Entered the office, a room frozen in the 90s, smelling of old paper and the cedar of my heavy oak desk with just a hint of the desert sage that Elena used to keep in a bowl by the window. This was my vault of records, a place Rhett avoided. Because it required the kind of patience and linear thinking he despised, I bypassed the digital noise of the laptop for a moment. Needing the tactile certainty of a paper trail, I began searching for a specific CVS pharmacy statement that had been nagging at the back of my brain. I found the folder, my fingers trembling in the 70 degrees air-conditioned room as I pulled out the crinkled sheet. The ink was bold and black. A clinical sentence of 3 refills in 4 months. I don't have a sleep disorder. I have a son. Refilled. 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 3 strikes and I was out literally. For months, I had been waking up with a heavy leaden feeling in my limbs, a cognitive fog I had attributed to the slow, inevitable erosion of age, and the grief of losing Elena. I had felt like a man walking through waist-deep water in the Arizona summer heat, struggling to reach the shore of a clear thought. You see, for a forensic accountant, the most dangerous variable is the one you assume is natural. I was starting to realize that my exhaustion wasn't a symptom of grief or the Phoenix climate. It was a manufactured state of subdual. I sat in the leather chair, the low hum of my old desktop computer's fan filling the silence, a mechanical companion in the desert night. I remembered the nightly tea Ivy had been preparing for me for the last 3 months. She would bring it to my room with a manufactured smile, claiming the herbal blend helped with my grief-related insomnia and the dry Phoenix heat. I could almost taste it now, that faint chalky aftertaste I had dismissed as a quirk of desert well water or my aging palate. It wasn't kindness. It was a dose of 50 mgs of dihydramine. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water to the face. I wasn't an aging man losing his grip. I was a healthy man being buried alive in a chemical fog created by over-the-counter sleep medication. The home computer's fan whirred like a distant jet engine in the Phoenix night. A mechanical growl that filled the silence of the office as I bypassed the password I wasn't supposed to know. I sat back in my leather chair, testing the steady beat of my own heart, wondering if my mind was truly my own, or if the Benadryl fog was still clouding my judgment in the 70 degrees air-conditioned sanctuary. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my glasses, casting a clinical ghostly glow over the dark wood of my desk. I opened the browser history, and the digital breadcrumbs began to form a trail of chilling intent through Arizona-specific searches. Over the last 3 months, Rhett had searched for terms like early-onset dementia symptoms versus Benadryl side effects, how to use diphenhydramine for elderly sedation, and Arizona guardianship laws elderly incompetence. My own son wasn't searching for a cure. He was searching for a cage built specifically under Arizona revised statutes. I found an unsent email draft to a Phoenix guardianship attorney dated for November 18, 2024. That was only 48 hours away. It mentioned a critical incident at a memorial party that would serve as the final proof of my instability, the very party I had just endured. He was planning to manufacture a public breakdown on the anniversary of Elena's death, one that would make my involuntary commitment look like an act of mercy to our Arcadia neighbors. I felt a surge of clinical horror, but my years as a forensic accountant took over, forcing me to look for the ledger behind the lie. How do you quantify the cost of a son who looks at his father and sees nothing but a slow, maturing bond certificate secured by Arizona real estate? I accessed the cloud drive and found a hidden folder labeled Project Legacy. I opened a document titled In the Matter of the Disability of Silus Vance. The sight of my own name on a legal petition for disability made the room feel smaller. The air thick with the smell of ozone from the warm computer tower despite the desert cooling outside. The petition claimed I suffered from hallucinations and extreme disorientation, with 3 witnesses from social services prepared to testify. The same 3 people who had been at the memorial party tonight. I realized then that every time I had felt confused or told him I saw things moving in the shadows of our Phoenix home, it wasn't my age. It was the 15-gram Benadryl dose. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing my defenses. The air conditioning cycled off and the resulting warmth of the Arizona night made me shiver, but I kept the rhythmic clicking of the mouse steady like a ticking clock. I found the liquidation spreadsheet next. Rhett had already contacted a firm called Arizona Fast Cash Homes, and they had a preliminary closing date set for January 2025. Every brick of this $650,000 home in Arcadia, every memory of Elena's desert garden with its barrel cacti and ocotillo had a price tag attached to it. Then I saw the date. November 18, 2024. The clock hadn't just been ticking. It was screaming. He had even listed my restricted assets, including Elena's Heritage Trust and my own pension, all slated to be moved into a new account controlled by him once he was appointed as my guardian under Arizona law. He was preparing for a total erasure of my autonomy. I scrolled further and found the guest list for the memorial party I had just witnessed. It wasn't just a random collection of his deadbeat friends. He had specifically invited 3 individuals who worked in Arizona social services and elder care, people he knew would be professional witnesses to my Benadryl drug state. I didn't let my hands shake as I inserted the thumb drive, the little red light blinking as it swallowed the digital evidence of my son's treachery, 1 kilobyte of betrayal at a time. The frantic blinking of the thumb drive's red LED was the only pulse in the room besides my own. As the progress bar crawled across the monitor, I reached down to retrieve my leather briefcase from beside the desk. My fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar taped to the underside of the frame. I peeled it back, my breath hitching as I realized it was a compact GPS tracking device. Rhett hadn't been just waiting for me to decline into the fog of sedatives. He'd been monitoring my every movement for weeks, tracking his investment like a cautious vulture. I finished my forensic tally with a cold clinical precision that would have made Elena proud. $147,650, the cost of a son. I categorized the charges with surgical detachment. The $8,500 down payment for a Tesla I never drove. The $400 in monthly life insurance premiums on my own head. And the countless consultancy fees siphoned into shell accounts. I printed 3 physical copies of the spreadsheet, the printer's mechanical whine cutting through the silence of the office, and tucked them into waterproof sleeves as if preparing for a flood that was already at my door. Before shutting down the computer, I uploaded the complete evidence package to 3 separate cloud storage accounts. A personal Google Drive, a Dropbox folder with 2-factor authentication, and a secure encrypted server I had used for client work, ensuring that even if Rhett destroyed the physical copies or the thumb drive, the digital trail would remain indestructible across 3 geographic data centers in California, Texas, and Virginia. How many fathers have to pack their lives into a canvas bag while their children sleep off the wine they stole from them? The question echoed in my mind as I knelt on the floor and shifted the rug to reveal the floor safe. Rhett had always viewed this office as a dusty relic of a bygone era, never imagining that the floorboards beneath his feet held the keys to the kingdom. Click. The safe door opened. The truth inside was heavier than the gold. I retrieved the original property deed for the Arcadia property, the parchment feeling cool and substantial in my hands. This isn't a house anymore. It's a target. I ran my thumb over the cold, heavy metal of the deed seal, confirmed in my name and Elena's only. As I moved to close the safe, my hand brushed a second smaller folder tucked into the rear corner. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside was a legal document showing that Elena had actually amended her will 2 weeks before she died. She had seen something in him, some lack of a moral compass that I had been too blinded by love to acknowledge. I packed the forensic go bag with the precision of a man preparing for a long-distance audit. The thumb drive, the printed ledgers, the property deed, a week's worth of heart medication I knew was safe, and my passport. I was leaving my history behind to save my future. I wasn't running. I was repositioning my assets for a counterstrike. The sharp rasp of a zipper on the canvas bag sounded like a thunderclap in the early morning stillness. Suddenly, a heavy rhythmic thud of a footstep sounded through the ceiling, vibrating the dust in the office air. The smell of dust and old parchment was replaced by the sudden metallic tang of adrenaline. The party was over and the predators were waking up. I stood in the doorway, my hand on the light switch as a second heavy footstep landed directly above my head. Rhett was awake. The kitchen was a graveyard of cheap ambition, the air smelling of sour grapes and cigarette ash. As I stepped into the wreckage of my own house, but it was the silence that felt the most like a blow. After the mechanical thud of Rhett's footsteps above me, the absolute stillness of the ground floor was unnerving. I moved through the space with the hypervigilance of a trespasser, my slippers sticking to the cold-filmed kitchen counter. Bottles of top-shelf gin stood like jagged monuments among half-eaten trays of appetizers, and the sharp vinegary stench of spilled wine hit me. I realized then that they hadn't just raided the pantry. They had drained the vintage cellar. My late wife, Silus Vance, was only 56 when cancer took her, a woman whose kindness was the foundation of our family until it became the very thing our son would exploit. She had saved those bottles for a special occasion, a milestone, a birth, a retirement that she never lived to see. Now they were just empty glass shells rolled into the trash. I looked down and saw a framed photo of her lying face down near a discarded beer can. The sight of it made my stomach wrench with a deep oily self-reproach. I knelt the joints and my knees popping in the quiet and reached for the frame. As my fingers touched the cold glass, the tactile sensation dragged me backward through time, pulling me into the sharp antiseptic smell of a hospital room in late autumn. 6 years, 2,190 days of letting a dead woman's wish drown a living man's life. In that memory, Elena's hand felt like dry, fragile, papery lace in mine. Her eyes were sunken, but fierce with a mother's desperate, unseeing love. She looked past me to where a 28-year-old Rhett stood by the window, already checking his watch, even as his mother's breath rattled. "Silas," she had whispered, her voice barely a thread. "Look after him. Promise me he'll always have a home with you." Blinded by grief, seeking only to give her peace in her final hour, I had squeezed her hand. "I promise, Elena, I'll take care of him." That was the contract I had signed in blood and sorrow. The one that had kept me a prisoner in my own home. I stood up in the present-day kitchen, the photo frame clutched in my hand. I stared at her smile and realized the depth of the betrayal. When does a promise stop being a sanctuary and start being a prison cell? Rhett had known about that vow. He had used it as a shield for years, a weapon to deflect every boundary I tried to set. Every time I questioned a late-night party or a missing account, he would bring up what Mom wanted, effectively turning her love into a tool for my destruction. He didn't just break the promise, he stole it. He turned a dying woman's hope into a license to kill the man she loved. I looked at the dog bowl on the table, then back at the photo. If Elena were alive to see this, to see her husband treated like a stray animal, she would be the first one to hand me the eviction papers. My promise was to protect the son she raised, not the parasite he became. I set the photo of Elena upright on the counter, but I didn't look at it. I looked at the dog bowl, and for the first time in years, the guilt was gone. The note I left on the counter was short, professional, and utterly devoid of the warmth Rhett had spent years draining from me. I placed it on the kitchen island, weighted down by a cold, half-empty coffee mug that bore a ring of stale grounds. Before I stepped away, I made one final deliberate choice. I slid the rusted metal dog bowl over the note, centering it perfectly like a paperweight for a death warrant. I knew Rhett would find it first thing in the morning when he emerged from his chemically induced stupor, looking for his father's submission. He would find a mirror of his own cruelty instead. I didn't just leave a message. I took the power cords to the kitchen appliances and the internet router, tucking them into my suitcase. I wanted his morning to start in total disconnected chaos. A silent house for a silent boy who had taken my voice for too long. I wheeled my suitcase out through the garage, moving with a ghost's precision to avoid the front doorbell camera. The silence of the car ride was a physical relief compared to the vulgar techno music that had assaulted my walls just hours before. The November morning air in Phoenix was cool, but not cold, hovering around 58 degrees, even at 4 in the morning. A welcome respite from the brutal summer heat that had defined the previous months. The dry desert air felt clean in my lungs as I backed the Honda out of the driveway. The sound of the tires on the concrete like a whisper of liberation in the pre-dawn stillness. I looked in the rearview mirror at the $650,000 house in the Arcadia neighborhood. No longer seeing a home or a sanctuary, but a crime scene that I was finally vacating. The neighborhood was a sea of Spanish tile roofs and carefully xeriscaped lawns dotted with Palo Verde trees and desert landscaping. Perfectly maintained facades hiding 1,000 similar rot-infested secrets behind stucco walls. 6 years of being the ghost in the machine. Today I was the one pulling the plug. I drove toward Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. The city lights beginning to blur as the sun struggled against the Arizona horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and copper. I arrived at the Travel Lodge near the airport at 6:45. It was a place where people went when they didn't want to be found or when they had nowhere else to go. The clerk behind the plexiglass was a woman in her 20s with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Shannon, someone who saw 100 men like me every week and remembered none of them. Just one night for now, I said, my voice sounding strange and gravelly in the empty lobby. Cash only. She didn't even look up as I counted out. $67. Room 4, she replied, sliding a cold clinical plastic key card through the slot. Checkout is at 11 o'clock. The Travel Lodge was a room designed for people who didn't want to be found, which made it the perfect headquarters for the man I was about to become. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the blue light of the motel sign flickering through the gap in the curtains and casting rhythmic ghostly shadows across the polyester spread. It was exactly 7 a.m., the start of a banking business day that would dismantle my son's life. I cleared the small circular motel table, sweeping aside a plastic tray of complimentary decaf, and meticulously laid out my evidence kit. The dry papery rustle of the spreadsheets on the table was a comforting familiar sound. I organized the printed data, the property deed, and the thumb drive into 6 distinct categories: identity theft, unauthorized credit usage, and the house. To any other man, this was a family tragedy. To me, it was a forensic audit that required a final closing statement. I didn't just take the power cords when I left. I had also extracted the original hard drive from the home computer and replaced it with an identical blank one. Rhett's access to the files he called Project Legacy was already gone, dissolved into silicon nothingness before he even opened his eyes. I logged into my administrative portal for the home security system I'd installed years ago, but rarely used. They thought they owned the stage, but I owned the recording. I checked the status of the cloud-recorded video from the night before, confirming that the high-definition footage of the dog bowl incident was safely backed up in 3 separate locations. Watching the digital playback, I felt the power shifting from the loud, arrogant voices in that kitchen to the quiet man sitting in room 114 with the admin password. I am a world of noise. Why is it always the quietest person in the room who holds the most dangerous secrets? I have spent 40 years finding the truth in the silences between numbers, and Rhett had left a deafening trail. I took a long drink of stale bottled water, avoiding the motel coffee to keep my hand steady. The sound of the highway traffic outside was muffled by the heavy motel curtains, a distant roar that grounded me. I lined up my burner phone and my primary phone on the nightstand, reviewing my target list: Chase, Amex, the local PD, and my attorney, Aurelia Prescott. The green digital glow of the microwave clock blinked with the rhythmic persistence of a heart monitor, counting down to the moment I would pull the plug on my son's lifestyle. I opened a secondary insurance portal one last time to check for any final anomalies. My blood turned to ice. Rhett had attempted to change the beneficiary on my $500,000 life insurance policy just 48 hours ago. The request was marked as pending, awaiting a physical signature I would never provide. He wasn't just gambling on my death. He was trying to speed up the payout. 0 hour had arrived. The clock hit 7 o'clock and the microwave let out a soft, sharp beep. I picked up the first phone, the cold, unyielding plastic of the burner feeling like a weapon in my palm, and dialed the priority line for Chase Fraud. It was time to stop being a father and start being a creditor. The first number on my list was Chase. I knew the prompts by heart. The automated voice, a comforting, familiar cadence in the silence of the motel room. The dry heat of the motel room felt thick, carrying the faint metallic scent of chlorine from the indoor pool down the hall and the heavy dusty smell of old carpet. I sat at the small laminate desk. The blue light of the laptop screen, making my eyes sting as I braced for the confrontation. Before I dialed, I verified the small checking account I had left untouched, a $200 honeypot designed to give Rhett a false sense of security. While I moved the heavy artillery into place, Kevin from the Chase Fraud Department had a voice like sandpaper and a script that favored the bank over the human, which was exactly the kind of cold ally I needed. I need to report identity theft by a family member. I said, my voice as level as a ledger line. I methodically listed the unauthorized charges from the memorial party, the premium liquor, and the catering fees siphoned from my savings. I formally revoked Rhett's authorized user status on every account. Mr. Vance, we can freeze the account immediately. Kevin replied, the clicking of his keys, a rhythmic percussion to my strategic dismantling. I requested new cards to be sent to the secure P.O. box I had opened weeks ago, effectively cutting the plastic lifeline Rhett had been choking me with. Have you ever noticed how quickly a shared life becomes a series of locked doors when the money stops flowing? It is a transition that happens in the space between a dial tone and a confirmation number. I moved to the next phase, calling the private wealth management arm where Elena's Heritage Trust was held. This was the crown jewel Rhett had been eyeing for his fictitious startup. I invoked the emergency lock provision I had drafted into the trust years ago. A clause meant for the very elder abuse I was now documenting. Lock the Elena Vance Heritage account, I told the manager. Full security protocol. No exceptions. The trust was instantly placed into a legal vault out of reach from the parasite who thought he could claim his inheritance before I was even in the ground. I felt a grim triumph of foresight over greed. Enter. Confirm. Denied. The three-step dance of a parasite losing its host began in earnest as I moved to the digital passwords. I spent the next hour systematically changing the keys to every corner of our shared household. Netflix, Amazon, the smart thermostat, and even the smart refrigerator fell under my control. For every single one, I used Dog Food 2024 as the universal key. It was a digital scar, a secret password to remind him of exactly what he had done every time he tried to log in for a distraction. During my final call with American Express, the representative mentioned a pending request. Silas, I found an order for a secondary card in the name of an Ivy Sterling placed just 4 hours ago, she noted. I almost laughed. While I was still in the house, a ghost in my own hallways, Rhett was already trying to expand the reach of his theft. I denied the request and closed the account entirely. The bank accounts were a fortress, now reinforced with the cold logic of an accountant who had finally finished his audit. But as I looked at the real-time call logs on my burner phone, I realized the alerts were already starting. Rhett had already begun trying to break in. I sat back and watched the first notification appear on my secondary screen like a digital flare over a sinking ship. Rhett was at a Starbucks in downtown Scottsdale, and he was about to have a very public, very caffeinated awakening. The rhythmic vibration of the phone on the motel nightstand was the only heartbeat in the room. A steady pulse of failed transactions that told a story more vivid than any confession. Through the merchant codes popping up on my banking app, I could reconstruct his morning with forensic precision. After the coffee failure, the notifications moved to a high-end bistro, the kind of place where the Scottsdale elite gather to discuss their equity over poached eggs. I saw the request hit 2 brunch specials and a bottle of expensive morning wine. Then came the red text declined. Transaction code 05. I imagined the sterile, high-pitched beep of the card reader echoing through the quiet restaurant. I could see my son fumbling with his leather wallet, his face likely turning the same shade of crimson as the bistro's awnings, while Ivy Sterling adjusted her designer sunglasses to hide from the judgment of the surrounding tables. They tried a backup card, then Ivy's. Both met the same silent digital wall. My analytical mind felt a surge of surgical satisfaction. Do you know the specific sound a lifestyle makes when it hits a brick wall? It sounds like the polite beep of a card reader saying no. It is the sound of a parasite suddenly realizing the host has developed an immune system. By 10:45, the notifications drifted toward a Best Buy. Rhett was attempting to buy a high-end VR headset, probably a replacement for the one he'd smashed during last night's festivities. The transaction for $2,000 was blocked before it even cleared the terminal. I realized then that my son was in a state of high-speed denial. He wasn't stopping to think. He was moving from store to store, hoping each failure was just a system glitch or a temporary hold. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, reaching for plastic life rafts that I had already punctured. I had left that $200 bait account active. But as he tried to use it for an Uber to get back to the house, I triggered a per-scheduled mortgage payment manually. The balance plummeted to exactly zeroed. The final notification came from a gas station near the edge of the suburb. Rhett tried to plug the Tesla into a supercharger, but the account was frozen tight. $57, the price of 2 fancy steaks or 3 days of survival. I knew which one they'd choose. I learned later through a frantic voicemail left on my blocked home line that they had pulled their physical cash and found exactly $57 between them. In the luxury interior of that car, surrounded by the smell of expensive leather and Ivy's lingering perfume, they were effectively broke. The power reversal was absolute. The silence of my car ride this morning was now theirs. But while mine was the silence of liberation, theirs was the silence of a dying ego. I checked the logs once more and noticed something interesting. The gas station stop wasn't just about the car. Rhett had tried to buy a burner phone, realizing I might be tracking his primary device. He was finally starting to think like the man he was trying to rob, but it was too little too late. They were trapped in the driveway of the house they claimed to own with a dead car and a dying ego, but then my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. The unknown number wasn't Rhett begging for his allowance. It was Aurelia Prescott's office confirming that the shark I'd hired was ready to smell the blood in my spreadsheets. I stepped into her glass fortress in downtown Phoenix, a space that smelled of expensive leather, old law books, and the cold ozone-scented air of ultimate authority. Aurelia Prescott, a woman whose reputation for legal lethality preceded her, stood silhouetted against a panoramic view of the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out my meticulously organized evidence kit on her mahogany desk. Before we even sat, she revealed her opening move. She had a contact in the district attorney's office specializing in elder abuse, and she had already flagged my case as a priority for criminal prosecution. I watched her expression shift from professional courtesy to a predator's focus as she scanned the Benadryl receipts and the draft guardianship petition Rhett had so carefully prepared. Mr. Vance, I see a lot of greed in this city, but this is predatory, she said, her voice dropping into a register of quiet steel. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the cold, smooth surface of her desk. I don't want a settlement, Aurelia. I want my life back. I want the parasite removed from the foundation. Do you know what 30 years feels like? It's the sound of a prison gate closing before you even realize you've been caught. Aurelia spent the next hour defining the felonies with the precision of a surgeon. The drugging wasn't just a betrayal. It was poisoning with intent. The guardianship draft was premeditated fraud. The unauthorized credit usage, federal-level identity theft. She estimated my son's criminal exposure at 30 to 40 years. I listened, realizing that the boy I had raised had effectively committed social and financial parasitism. Good, I said the word, feeling heavy and right in my throat. Let the punishment fit the ledger. Aurelia's fountain pen scratched across the 14-day eviction notice like a scalpel, cutting away the rot Rhett had let fester in our home. The sharp sound of the nib on heavy parchment was the first note of a new symphony. We finalized the 5-step retaliation plan. The server would drop the notice Monday. The locks would be changed. The cameras I'd already purchased would be installed. And the formal police report would be filed simultaneously. The deadline was set for December 2nd at 5 o'clock. I paid her $850 in cash, peeling the bills from my envelope. It was a fraction of what Rhett had stolen, but it was the most satisfying purchase of my life. The clock starts the moment the server drops the paper, she said, closing the document folder with a heavy thud. I've waited 6 years for this clock to start, I replied. While reviewing the deed one last time, she noticed a final desperate move. Rhett had tried to take out a second mortgage on the house using a forged signature. The bank had flagged it for a manual review, the very review I had inadvertently triggered by freezing my accounts this morning. He was trying to sell the roof over my head before he even had the legal right to the floor. I walked out of that office with a stack of papers that felt heavier than a lead pipe. But when I turned on my phone in the elevator, the first voicemail made my blood run cold. The elevator doors hissed open, but I didn't move. I just stared at the notification on my screen. 14 missed calls, 23 texts, and 7 voicemails that were about to serve as the first movement in my son's symphony of panic. I stood there for a long moment, the stack of legal papers from Aurelia's office feeling like a lead pipe in my hand before finally stepping out into the shadows of the law office parking garage. I reached my Honda and climbed inside, the smell of the car's leather heated by the afternoon Phoenix sun rising to meet me. I gripped a bottle of water, the cold condensation biting into my palm, and hit play on the first recording. Rhett's voice flooded the cabin, crackling with a static-filled urgency that only comes from a man who has just watched his credit limit evaporate. He started with the house landline, a detail that made me smile. It meant the Tesla was truly dead in the driveway and they were essentially stranded in the Arizona heat. Dad, pick up the first recording, began, his tone still clinging to a shred of casual entitlement. The cards are dead. All of them. This isn't funny. By the third call, the facade was crumbling into high-pitched, vibrating anxiety. Ivy's voice shrieked in the background, a shrill accusatory staccato blaming Rhett for breaking their lifestyle. Silas, if you're trying to make a point, it's costing us a lot of social capital. Call us back. It was a satisfying observation of their faces beginning to crack under the Phoenix pressure. Have you ever heard a grown man realize his safety net has been replaced with a concrete floor? It's a sound you don't forget. It is the sound of gravity finally winning. The fourth and fifth voicemails revealed the inevitable pivot to manipulation. Rhett's voice softened, adopting a practiced mournful cadence as he invoked Elena's name. Mom wouldn't want this, Dad. You're acting like a stranger. He tried to negotiate, promising we would sit down and talk if I just unlocked the secondary chase card for basic necessities. Just give us enough to get through the weekend. We'll fix everything on Monday. I felt a surge of pure disgust. Using my late wife as a weapon to secure gas money was a blow even I hadn't fully prepared for, but it only served to harden my tactical resolve. Rhett's voice was a jagged piece of glass cutting through the quiet of my car, trying to find a soft spot to bleed me one last time. But I was no longer a host for his parasites. The final voicemail recorded after he had clearly sought solace in whatever alcohol remained in the house was a dark transition into open malice. "If you aren't here by 6, I'm calling a locksmith," he spat the words, slurring slightly. "It's my house, too, old man. Try me." In the background, past the static of his rage, I heard a distinct hollow boom, the sound of my home office door being kicked in the Phoenix heat. He was already hunting for the safe. He didn't realize I had already emptied it. I remained calm, my finger hovering over the screen to record the audio file before emailing it directly to Aurelia as evidence of an illegal lockout threat. I watched the delete button glow on my dashboard screen for a second, then cleared the clutter of his voice from my device. Silence was my most powerful weapon, and I was going to use it until he started to starve in the Arizona desert heat. The next morning, the sun didn't bring warmth, only a clinical clarity that drove me back to the shared laptop. I wasn't looking for bank statements anymore. I was searching for the things you can't replace with a wire transfer. The air in the motel room felt stagnant, smelling of the cold plastic desk and the faint lingering scent of industrial lemon cleaner. I bypassed the standard login screens and dove into the browser cookies, following a digital scent that led me to a secondary eBay account. When the completed listings page loaded, my stomach dropped into a cold, hard knot. There, in grainy, oversaturated photos, was Elena's vintage sapphire pendant and her grandmother's diamond brooch. I had believed they were still safely locked in the velvet-lined jewelry box in our bedroom. The listings were cold and efficient, describing them as estate finds with a quick sale required. I realized with a jolt of localized humiliation that the pendant had been sold to a buyer right here in the Phoenix metro area. It wasn't just a private theft. It was a public auction of my wife's dignity to someone who probably lived just miles away in Scottsdale or Paradise Valley. Category heirloom status sold. I typed the words into my spreadsheet, my fingers feeling numb. I traced the $11,200 payout from those sales directly to a PayPal account linked to Rhett's watch reselling startup, but the money hadn't gone toward inventory or business expenses. It had been withdrawn in jagged $500 cash chunks over the course of a single week in mid-March. I cross-referenced the dates with Ivy Sterling's Instagram feed and the pieces of the betrayal locked into place. Bottle service. $11,000 of sapphires turned into bubbles and ego in under 4 hours at a Scottsdale nightclub. There was a photo of them at Bottled Blonde Scottsdale, an exclusive club in Old Town Rhett, posing with a practiced hollow grin behind 3 bottles of vintage champagne that cost more than his mother's wedding ring. The geotag showed the exact location, East 5th Avenue, Scottsdale, Arizona. He had sold her history to buy a night of pretending he mattered in the Phoenix party scene. The sound of the laptop fan struggling with the heat of the processing was the only noise in the room, a mechanical rasp that mirrored the rising heat in my chest. My son had turned our family history into a clearance rack, and I was the only one left to pay the bill. I looked at the screen until my eyes burned, forced to witness the liquidation of Elena's very soul in the neon-lit wasteland of Scottsdale nightlife. I added the $19,000 appraised value of the missing jewelry to the master ledger, the total mounting like a flood. The escalation had begun exactly 18 months ago, coinciding perfectly with the day Rhett's actual business license had been dissolved for non-payment of taxes. The startup was never a dream. It was a front for a pawnshop lifestyle funded by the dead and the aging. "You didn't just steal my money, Rhett. You stole her goodbye." I found one final digital receipt in the cash. A registration for a self-defense training course Rhett had signed up for just last week at a Phoenix gym. It wasn't just the drugging. He was preparing for the moment I woke up. He was readying himself for a physical confrontation if his chemical cage failed to hold me. I saved the file and closed the laptop with a finality that felt like a tombstone hitting the earth. I couldn't breathe in that small motel room anymore. The air tasted like the dust of everything I'd lost. And I knew that if I didn't act now, I would never breathe again. I didn't cry. Accountants don't cry over bad debt. They write it off, but for a few minutes in that suffocating beige room, I forgot how to breathe. I sat on the thin, scratchy polyester of the motel floor, the smell of stale air and industrial lemon cleaner clogging my lungs. My hands were wrapped around the cold, abrasive metal of the dog bowl I had brought with me. It was more than a prop now. It was a physical manifestation of a horror I had only just decoded. I realized that this wasn't just a random dish Rhett had pulled from the garage. It was Max's bowl. Max, our golden retriever, had supposedly run away while I was lost in the first year of my grief, but looking at the neglected, rusted state of it, I saw the truth. Rhett had tested his capacity for neglect on the dog before he moved on to me. The boy who used to collect polished stones and name the constellations was dead. I reviewed the Project Legacy files one last time on the laptop, seeing them now as a blueprint for Rhett's total annihilation. You wanted a museum, Rhett? I'm going to make sure you're the main exhibit. The father who had agonized over family dinners and birthday cards died in this motel room at 10 in the morning. Only the creditor remained. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over Aurelia Prescott's number. I wasn't going to wait for the weekend to crawl to a close while they enjoyed the house. I wanted the 14-day notice served the second the sun broke over the horizon on Monday morning. I dialed, and the distorted professional tone of Aurelia's voice filled the room. Authorization confirmed, Aurelia. I said, my voice as flat and cold as a winter lake. I want you to share every scrap of evidence we have with the district attorney immediately. The Benadryl, the eBay sales, the guardianship draft, all of it. Burn it all down. Professionally, of course. Click. The line went dead. The war had officially begun. I revealed nothing of my own fear, only my mandate. I had been recording my own mental state diary for months, a secret audio log of my sharpest thoughts and precise memories, which would now serve as devastating counter-evidence to any claim of cognitive decline he might try to manufacture. I walked into the bathroom and stood under the harsh, unforgiving light of the mirror. I didn't recognize the man staring back, his eyes hard and clinical, but I liked him a hell of a lot more than the victim I'd been for 2 years. Monday morning arrived with the cool, dry clarity of a Phoenix November. The temperature, a comfortable 62 degrees, a perfect day for serving a cold dish of reality to a son who thought he'd already won. I sat in the hushed, sterile confines of my motel room, the low hum of the laptop fan my only companion, as I waited for the notification. At exactly 9:47, Thane Garrison pulled into my driveway in Arcadia. Thane Garrison, a 38-year-old retired Phoenix PD officer with a jawline like a curbstone and a body cam that didn't miss a single lie, was the perfect man to deliver my message. He wasn't just a professional I'd hired. He was a former colleague of Elena's from her volunteer work at the Phoenix Art Museum. Someone who personally witnessed Rhett's blatant disrespect at her funeral years ago and had volunteered for the task with a grim, knowing smile. On my screen, the wide-angle distortion of the body cam footage flickered to life. I watched through his eyes as he stepped out of his vehicle, the dry November desert wind carrying the scent of creosote through his microphone. He adjusted the strap of his thick blue folder, his boots crunching rhythmically on the decorative gravel that formed the desert landscaping I used to tend so carefully past the towering saguaro cactus and the Palo Verde trees. The sharp snap of the folder being shifted under his arm sounded like a gunshot in the quiet Arizona morning. He didn't hesitate. He hammered on the door with the authority of a man who had spent a decade making the guilty tremble under the relentless Phoenix sun. Rhett opened the door after the third knock, looking hungover, disheveled, and frantic. His eyes were bloodshot, probably from a night spent trying to figure out why the lights were still on, but the money was gone. His initial irritation vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, unfiltered terror the moment he saw the uniformed rigidity of Thane's posture against the bright Arizona sky. Rhett Vance, Thane said, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the dry desert air. You've been served under Arizona Revised Statute Section 33 to 1368. Click. The seal was broken. The countdown to homelessness had begun in the Phoenix heat. This is Rhett stammered, his ragged, panic breathing clearly audible on the recording. He can't do this. It's my house. I'm his son. Actually, the deed says otherwise. Thane replied, his tone unshakable as he thrust the paperwork into Rhett's trembling hands. You have 14 days to vacate this property in Arcadia. Holdover penalties begin immediately under Arizona law. Is it cruel to watch a man's pride dissolve in 1080p resolution under the desert sun? Perhaps. But I wasn't feeling particularly merciful. By 11:30, I was leaning back in my stiff motel chair, replaying the upload. I watched my son crumble in high definition, his knees nearly buckling as he stood on the porch. He thought he'd stolen the Phoenix skyline visible behind him. He clutched the 4-page evidence list detailing the Benadryl poisoning, the fraud, the identity theft, and I realized the physical weight of that paper was what finally made the threat real. Paper is proof, Rhett, I whispered to the empty room. And you're out of ink. In the corner of the frame, past Rhett's shaking shoulder, I caught a glimpse of Ivy Sterling. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't crying. She was in the background already dragging a small designer suitcase toward the stairs. The rats were already fleeing the ship before it had even finished sinking. I zoomed in on Rhett's shaking hands as he reached the 3rd page of the notice. The page detailing the Benadryl receipts. He knew he wasn't just being evicted. He was being hunted. The phone buzzed just as the video of Rhett's shaking hands ended. A 773 area code flashed across the screen, and Ivy's sister, the woman who had spent 3 years believing I was the villain in her sister's curated fairy tale. I took a sip of the lukewarm motel water, the flat taste of it grounding me as I prepared to engage. Bianca, a 32-year-old school teacher and Ivy's older sister, had a voice that usually carried the sharp edge of unearned moral superiority until the facts began to dull it. She didn't even wait for me to say hello before the barrage began. Silus, how can you do this to your own flesh and blood? She demanded, her voice shrill through the smartphone. Ivy is in tears. She says you've gone unhinged, trying to throw them out on the street over some petty misunderstanding at a party. You're a heartless old man. I leaned back against the headboard of the stiff motel bed. The cold, smooth texture of the screen pressed against my ear. I listened to her for nearly 2 minutes, letting her exhaust her rehearsed outrage. Bianca, I said finally, my voice possessing the forensic calm of an auditor. You've been given a script. I'm about to give you the facts. She tried to interrupt, but I spoke over her, reading from the ledger I had meticulously compiled. I started with the eBay sales. I gave her the exact dates and the $11,000 total from the sale of Elena's jewelry, the sapphires, and the diamond brooch. Then I moved to the pharmacy receipts for the Benadryl. Have you ever noticed how the truth has a specific weight? It doesn't just convince, it crushes. I explained the guardianship plot, detailing how the misunderstandings she'd heard about were actually staged drugged episodes meant to facilitate my own chemical incarceration. I even mentioned that Ivy had been telling her family I was violent when off my meds, a lie designed to make my eventual disappearance look like a medical necessity. The electronic hum of the motel's fluorescent lighting seemed to grow louder in the following silence. Bianca's ragged, uneven breathing was the only sound on the other end of the line. I had no idea, she whispered. She told me you were losing your mind. She asked me for a $5,000 loan this morning to help fight your elderly confusion in court. I sat up straighter, the weight of her realization hanging heavy in the air. Don't send the money, Bianca, I advised. Unless you want to be an accomplice to fraud, I suggest you check your own accounts if she ever had access to them. Cut the ties now before the district attorney involves you in an investigation that is already moving toward criminal charges. Silence. Absolute, heavy, the sound of a bridge burning. Bianca began to cry. The jagged sound of her sobbing replacing the previous arrogance. She revealed that Ivy and Rhett had already planned a housewarming party for January to celebrate their full ownership of the estate. They were already dancing on the grave of my autonomy. I won't call again, she managed to say through her tears. I'm so sorry, Silus. I truly am. The call ended notification appeared on my screen, leaving me in the quiet of my temporary headquarters. I had isolated the predators, stripping them of their last lifeline. They were alone in that house, now surrounded by the ghosts they had tried to sell. I sat in the quiet motel room, the only witness to the sound of Bianca's heartbreak for the sister she no longer knew. I had isolated the predators, but now I had to find where they buried the business. The next morning, I didn't look at social media. I looked at the Arizona Corporation Commission's corporate search portal, where the legacy my son claimed to be building was waiting for its autopsy. The blue light of the screen burned my eyes, a sharp clinical glare that seemed to strip away the last of my familial delusions. I sat in the cramped motel chair, the dry, stale smell of the room's wall unit heater filling my nose. I typed in the name of Rhett's LLC, the startup that had supposedly been the reason he needed to live in my house rent-free for the last 2 years. The results were instantaneous and damning. Status: involuntary dissolution. A digital stamp in bright red ink appeared on the document. The business had been legally terminated 18 months ago for failure to file annual reports. 18 months of living a ghost story. Every mention of his growing enterprise and impending brand deals had been a calculated lie designed to maintain his parasitic grip on my life. I felt a cold analytical satisfaction ripple through me, followed quickly by a rising tide of disgust. As I dug deeper into the cloud drive, I found a deleted folder hidden in the cache. My breath hitched as I recovered a file titled simply Obituary. It was pre-written, a template of my own death that mentioned my long and courageous battle with cognitive decline. He wasn't just planning for my disability. He was prepared for the drugging to have a lethal outcome if the guardianship path moved too slowly. I realized then that my son was a vulture who didn't even have the decency to wait for the heart to stop beating. You know what it's like to see your own death planned in a Microsoft Excel file. It's remarkably tidy. I moved my focus to Ivy Sterling's digital empire. Using the forensic tools I'd spent decades mastering, I examined her metrics. Nearly 90% of her followers were hollow bots, and her so-called brand deals were actually products she had purchased herself to simulate a demand that didn't exist. Zero income, infinite entitlement. The entire existence of that couple was a house of cards that required my $650,000 home as its singular foundation. I returned to the guardianship drafts connecting the death of the startup to the birth of the drugging protocol. The moment his real business died, Rhett began the chemical sedation. I found a spreadsheet of memory care facilities in the Project Legacy folder with the top choice highlighted in yellow. It cost exactly $5,000 a month, the precise amount my pension and Social Security provide. He wasn't trying to save me or provide for me. He was budgeting me into a cage. He wanted to liquidate me. I discovered that he'd even been paying for Ivy's bot followers using my business checking account, labeling the charges as office supplies. My blood turned to ice as I hit the send button on my email, the sharp ping echoing in the quiet room as the entire Project Legacy folder was forwarded to Aurelia. I wrote a single sentence in the body of the message. He was going to erase my mind, then my existence. I leaned back, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The jarring physical vibration of the motel door being struck suddenly shook the entire room. The heavy, frantic pounding wasn't the polite rap of a maid. It was the strike of someone who had lost everything but his arrogance. The knock wasn't the polite rap of a maid. It was the frantic, heavy pounding of someone who had lost everything but his arrogance. And I knew exactly whose knuckles were bruising against the cheap wood of room 114. I stood in the center of the room, my heart hammering a cold, precise rhythm against my ribs. I had already alerted the motel front desk to record the hallway security footage of any uninvited guests. And now my son was performing exactly as scripted. I moved to the door and opened it just enough for the security chain to engage with a sharp metallic rattle. Rhett stood in the hallway looking wild-eyed and disheveled. The polished influencer mask had shattered, leaving behind a desperate man with bloodshot eyes and a twitching jaw. I could smell the sweat and the sour tang of stale alcohol radiating off him through the gap. Dad opened the door. He pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're having some kind of breakdown. Let me in so I can help you. We can fix the accounts together. The only thing breaking down, Rhett, is the fiction you've been living in." I replied, my voice sounding like an auditor's gavel. I watched him flinch as I began to list his sins with clinical detachment. I told him about the Benadryl receipts. I mentioned the eBay records for Elena's jewelry and the draft guardianship petition I'd found on the cloud drive. His face drained of color, turning a sickly translucent gray as he realized I hadn't just stumbled upon his secrets. I had built a forensic cage around them. Lies. They weren't even good lies. They were the frantic scratches of a cornered rat. "You're overreacting," he shouted, his eyes darting toward the security camera in the ceiling. "Ivy was just trying to help you sleep because you kept forgetting things I didn't forget. Rhett, I was drugged. There's a difference, and a lab test will prove exactly what was in my system 6 hours ago." In a final, desperate pivot, he tried to use his last weapon. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing out a tear. "Mom would be so ashamed of you right now, Silus. She'd hate what you're doing to her only son." How many times had I let that specific tone, that tremor in his voice buy him another month of my life? Not today. "You sold her memory for bottle service and a VIP table, Rhett. You sold her grandmother's brooch to buy bot followers for a fake business. You don't get to say her name ever again." I realized in that moment that the man standing in the hallway was a stranger wearing my son's face, and the last tether of guilt that had bound me to Elena's deathbed promise finally snapped. He reached out to grab the edge of the door, but I stepped back, my resolve as hard as carbon. I looked him in the eye and felt nothing but the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. "Before I close this door, you should know that I've already called a locksmith. He's meeting me at the house in 30 minutes. By the time you get back to Phoenix, you'll find you're locked out of your own bedroom. Try the dog bowl if you're hungry." I closed the door on his shouting, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. I had 12 days left on the clock, and I was going home to change the locks. The absolute, heavy silence of the motel room after the door shut was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. The drive back to Arcadia House felt like a victory lap, even if the race wasn't officially over. But the sight of my dead Tesla blocking the driveway reminded me that the rot was still sitting in my living room. I pulled my Honda to the curb right behind the familiar white van belonging to Lyle. Lyle, a 60-year-old locksmith with hands stained by graphite and a memory for every door he'd ever opened in Phoenix, worked with a speed that only comes from decades of knowing exactly what people are trying to hide. I had chosen him specifically because he was also a licensed private investigator. His presence served as a legal welfare check on my property. Ivy Sterling was waiting on the porch. Her white-knuckled grip on the door frame a testament to her desperation. "You can't do this, Silus," she shrieked, trying to block the entrance with her slight frame. "We live here. This is illegal." I didn't raise my voice. I merely held up the notarized 14-day eviction notice and the property deed. "You have 13 days left to reside here, Ivy," I said, my voice as cold and heavy as the high-security deadbolts Lyle was pulling from his kit. "These keys, however, are now at my discretion." As the sole owner, Lyle stepped past her without a word. The high-pitched whine of his power drill cut through her protests. He began replacing the standard, easily bypassed cylinders with pick-resistant, heavy-duty hardware that smelled faintly of industrial oil and fresh-cut brass. Drill. Snap. Click. 3 sounds that stripped the parasites of their last bit of leverage. While Lyle worked on the secondary exits, I began my own installation. I moved through the living room and kitchen, mounting state-of-the-art security cameras in the corners of the ceiling. Ivy followed me, fuming, her eyes darting between me and the small red blinking lights. "Think of them as digital witnesses, Ivy," I told her, as I tightened the final bracket. "They are motion-activated and record directly to a cloud server I control. They never blink and they never lie. Any attempt to damage the walls, the furniture, or my belongings will be captured in 4,000 pixel resolution for the police." The house was finally starting to breathe again, the new locks acting like a tourniquet on a wound that had been bleeding for 2 years. I could feel the space reclaiming its own history, pushing out the stagnant air of the party and the chemical haze of the last few months. Lyle finished the final door and handed me a small plastic bag containing the new keys. "That'll be $85, Silus," he said, his eyes scanning the room with professional curiosity. I paid him in cash, the crisp bills a small price for the security he'd provided. I turned to Ivy and handed her exactly one key. Rhett will have to share this with you, I informed her. I suggest you start packing the things you actually own. Tampering with this hardware is a criminal offense. I opened the mobile app on my phone, watching the live feed of my own kitchen while standing 5 feet away from her. She looked defeated, her shoulders slumped, but as I turned to leave, my eyes caught a glint of light under the coffee table. A small red LED was glowing from a hidden recording device she taped to the underside. She was trying to catch me in an abusive outburst to use in court. I walked back to my car, the app on my phone showing the red RX. They didn't know I was already watching their first move from the driveway. The screen of my phone was a tiny high-def window back into the world I'd just secured, glowing with the infrared ghosts of the people who still thought they could steal my life. I parked my Honda a block away under the shadow of a dying oak tree and watched the live feed of my own kitchen. The steering wheel felt like it was vibrating under my grip as the adrenaline of the confrontation at the motel began to cool into a hard crystalline focus. On the screen, the wide-angle lens captured Rhett as he slammed through the back door, his face twisted into a mask of sweat and fury. Ivy was standing by the island, her hands hovering over a half-packed bag. I watched them exchange words through the muffled, distorted audio of the phone speaker. Two predators realizing the cage had been reinforced while they were out hunting. "Did he give you a key?" Rhett barked, his chest heaving. "Did you let that old man walk all over us?" Ivy's response was a sharp defensive staccato. "He had a locksmith. What was I supposed to do? Fight a cop?" The irony wasn't lost on me. They were arguing over a home that was no longer their sanctuary, but a legal trap. Rhett stormed toward my home office, and the feed switched as he triggered the motion sensor in the hallway. I watched him grab a crowbar from the garage bench and drop to his knees in front of my desk. The sharp metallic screech of the pry bar against the oak floorboards echoed through my car, a sound that felt like a physical violation. There is something uniquely haunting about watching your own flesh and blood try to pry a safe out of the floorboards while you sit in a Honda eating a sandwich. He threw his entire weight into the lever, his face turning a dark, bruised purple in the grainy infrared light. But the safe didn't budge, and even if it had, the only thing inside was the dust of his own expectations. "It's gone," he screamed, the audio peaking into a digital hiss. "Everything is gone. He's cleaned it out." In that moment of frantic realization, I heard him admit something that made my blood turn to ice. He shouted to Ivy that he had already sold the house to a group of shady private investors in a handshake deal to cover his debts. And now he was terrified of what those people would do when they found out he didn't even have the deed. Not of grief, but of pure bankrupt ego. Back in the living room, the parasites began to implode. Ivy's face was a distorted fisheye of contempt as she screamed that she wasn't going to jail for his ego. Rhett fired back, accusing her of being the one who pushed the dog food stunt too far, claiming she enjoyed every cent of the stolen money. I watched as the bond of greed that held them together disintegrated in real time. Ivy pulled out her own phone and began recording Rhett's drunken meltdown, her eyes cold and calculating as she prepared her own victim narrative to throw him under the bus. I turned off the screen as she reached for her car keys. They were imploding faster than even I had calculated. But the most dangerous part of a cornered animal is the final bite. The legal hammer didn't just fall. It arrived in the form of a high-priority PDF that would dictate the next 15 years of my son's life, transforming his arrogance into a very specific monthly line item. I sat in the hushed gloom of Motel Room 114, the blue-white glare of the document burning into my tired eyes. I sipped on lukewarm motel coffee, its bitter edge matching the clinical precision of the numbers staring back at me. This was Aurelia Prescott's masterpiece of forensic pressure, a cold tally of the theft and damages totaling exactly $147,650. The terms were uncompromising, $820 per month for 180 months. I had specifically calculated that figure to leave Rhett with the exact amount for groceries that I had been forced to live on while he was liquidating my life. It wasn't just a repayment plan. It was a 15-year sentence of living in my shoes. $820 every month until he's 50. I let the realization settle over me, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic roar of Sky Harbor planes taking off into the Arizona sky. I reached for my phone and dialed Aurelia. "Prison doesn't pay debts, Aurelia," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy boot. "If I put him in a cage for 40 years, he becomes the state's problem. I want him to be mine. I want him to remember my name every time he signs a check for the next decade and a half. I want him to feel the weight of the dog bowl every time he tries to buy a steak. Would Elena be proud? Or would she see the coldness in my eyes and realize that the man she loved had finally died along with our son's integrity?" It was a question that had no place in an audit, so I buried it. I chose the agreement not out of a father's lingering mercy, but because it forced Rhett to live as a responsible adult or face the criminal complaint I had already signed and dated. "It's a long leash, Silus," Aurelia reminded me, her voice professional and sharp over the speaker. "One slip, one missed payment, and the felonies go live." "He won't slip," I replied. "I'll be the one holding the leash." Click. Send. The digital guillotine was in the air. I felt a cold sweat prickle my palms as I gave the final authorization to transmit the ultimatum. The email carried a 72-hour deadline for his signature and a non-negotiable move-out date of December 2nd. I watched the send confirmation flicker on my screen, followed a second later by the sharp clinical ping of the delivery receipt. Rhett's phone was about to buzz with the most expensive choice he has ever faced. Aurelia had mentioned during our call that Rhett already tried to hire a reputation management firm to scrub the internet of his party videos, but they'd shown him the door when his card was declined. He was already a ghost in the world he prized so much. The choice is his now. Prison or accountability? I leaned back and opened the security app, the grainy feed of my living room appearing on the screen. I sat in the silence, waiting for the first scream of realization to echo through the house I once called home. The night feed from the living room camera was grainy, but the look on Rhett's face when he opened that email was crystal clear, a slow-motion derailment, captured in a high-definition green glow. I sat in the dry, recycled air of my motel room, watching the infrared ghosts of my life pace across the screen. Rhett was in the kitchen, Ivy hovering over his shoulder as the blue-white light of his smartphone illuminated their features. Their initial laughter at what they probably thought was my pathetic attempt to regain control turned into a frozen, jagged silence as they scrolled through the 4 pages of forensic evidence. The figure of $147,650 hit them like a physical blow. $81,000 in unauthorized charges. Rhett shouted, his voice distorted by the speakerphone. "Ivy, what the hell did you buy?" Ivy didn't flinch. "Don't you dare blame me, Rhett. You signed for the Tesla. You wanted the VIP tables." The alliance of greed that had held them together was finally beginning to splinter under the weight of a 15-year debt. I watched with a surgical focus, feeling a deep sense of analytical satisfaction as they realized the influencer lifestyle they had built on my back was officially over. Have you ever seen the exact moment 2 parasites realize there's no more blood in the host? They don't mourn the host. They eat each other. Ivy was the first to pivot. I watched her through the living room camera as she realized the restitution agreement included a provision making her civilly liable as an accomplice if Rhett defaulted. She turned on him with a venom that made me wonder if she had ever loved him at all. "You're a loser, Rhett," she spat, her face a contorted mask in the fisheye lens. "You couldn't even drug an old man correctly. You let him wake up." Rhett's frantic, heavy breathing filled the room as he realized Ivy had already been searching for apartments for herself on her phone. "I'm the loser. You're the one who sold my mother's jewelry." I watched Ivy secretly photograph Rhett's private journal when he turned his back to Pace. She was looking for leverage to trade for her own immunity with the district attorney. The night descended into a frantic, disjointed chaos. Ivy threw the remote control at the television. My television and the high-pitched chatter of the plastic was the only sound in the house for a long minute. Crash. The remote hit the wall. The screen went black. Their future was following suit. Rhett spent the next hour staring at Elena's photo on the mantel, his expression flickering between a hollow guilt and sheer terror. I noticed through the kitchen audio that Ivy had been hiding a secret bank account with $4,000 she had siphoned from my grocery money over the last year. It was enough for her to run, but not enough to save Rhett from the ledger I had prepared. By 3 o'clock in the morning, they weren't speaking. They were just two ghosts haunting a house they no longer owned, waiting for a sunrise that brought only death. The cold digital blue light of their screens was the only thing illuminating the ruins of their ego. I turned off the screen as the sun began to peek over the Phoenix horizon. I had 48 hours left on my ultimatum. But then my phone buzzed with a text that wasn't from a lawyer. The silence that followed the final deadline was heavier than the noise that preceded it, a hollow ringing quiet in the Phoenix night. That meant the war was finally over and the rebuilding could begin. I sat in the dim light of the motel room near Sky Harbor Airport, watching the shadow of a heater fan rotate against the peeling wallpaper as planes roared overhead in the desert darkness. The sharp blue light of my laptop screen illuminated the finality of the situation. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on December 2nd, 2024, 1 minute past the 72-hour deadline, a notification pinged through the dry Arizona air. It was a DocuSign confirmation from Rhett's appointed legal aid in Phoenix. He signed. He actually signed. Every page was initialed, every predatory clause accepted, including the 15-year restitution schedule of $820 per month and the mandate to vacate the Arcadia property by sunset today. I also made sure the agreement contained a specific clawback clause under Arizona contract law. If Rhett ever mentions my mental health or uses the word dementia to anyone again, the entire $147,650 becomes due in a single lump sum. I wanted to ensure that the lie he used as a weapon would become the very thing that bankrupts him. I leaned back in the creaking chair, feeling a victory so hollow it felt like a cavern opening up in my chest. Victory in family court isn't a trophy. It's just a smaller pile of rubble than the one your opponent is sitting on. I reviewed the final terms one last time with clinical detachment. Rhett was currently being processed for release at the Phoenix Police Department on trespassing charges after his failed attempt to break into my home office. Those charges would only be downgraded to a civil infraction if he followed the timeline and cleared out by 5 o'clock this evening. A signature doesn't fix a soul, but it pays the property tax on $650,000 of Arizona real estate. The man who signed that paper isn't my son anymore. He's just a debtor whose legal acknowledgement is the only thing standing between him and a Maricopa County cell. Ping. The document was complete. The boy was gone. I began packing my suitcase, the tactile snap of the latches sounding like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I checked the surveillance app one last time. The Arcadia house was a tomb. Ivy was long gone, fleeing back to her sister in Scottsdale, but she hadn't left without one final attempt at larceny. I found an urgent email from Bianca informing me that Ivy had already listed the Tesla on a Phoenix area auction site. Since the car was in my name, I had to spend the early morning hours filing a theft report with the Phoenix PD and a cease and desist to stop the sale. I packed my original property deed into my go bag right next to the framed photo of Elena taken in our backyard against the Camelback Mountain backdrop. I took a deep breath of the cold, dry motel air, preparing myself for the last mile across the Phoenix sprawl. The driveway was littered with the remnants of a life that was never really mine to begin with. Discarded Amazon boxes, a broken high-end blender, and the heavy oppressive silence of a neighborhood that had seen too much. I sat in my Honda 3 houses down, the cold, heavy weight of the binoculars against my eyes as I watched a beat-up U-Haul van idle in front of my home. The rumble of the engine was a low industrial growl that punctuated the suburban afternoon. I observed Rhett struggling alone with heavy plastic bins, his movements sluggish and devoid of his usual performative energy. He looked smaller, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own failure. For the first time, he just looked like a man who lost. I noticed he was wearing the cheap, worn-out sneakers he had when he first moved back in. He had seemingly sold or lost all the designer shoes my siphoned money had bought him. There was no sign of Ivy Sterling. The Tesla remained on the lawn like a beached whale dead and waiting for the tow truck I had already summoned. Rhett made several trips to the curb, tossing out items I recognized as Project Legacy props, expensive outfits, ring lights, and stacks of fake business documents. Is it possible to win a war and still feel like you're standing in a field of glass? I watched him stop at the edge of the property, staring back at the house for a long minute. It was the look of a man realizing he didn't just lose a roof. He lost the last person who believed in his potential. It's not your museum anymore, Rhett, I whispered to the windshield. It's just a house. The sun was setting low over the suburban rooftops, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to reach for him like dark fingers. Before climbing into the U-Haul, Rhett walked toward the small stone alcove where Elena's favorite garden statue stands. He placed a small velvet item on the stone and bowed his head, his lips moving in a silent apology that only the security cameras and my lenses caught. I didn't need the word. I needed the weight of it to be real. The engine turned. The van pulled away. The silence returned, but this time it was clean. I waited until the tail lights vanished around the corner before I finally put the car in gear. I drove to the house and walked straight to the garden altar. My heart hammered as I reached for the item he had left behind. It wasn't jewelry or a key. It was the first accounting trophy I had ever won, a small gold-plated figure I thought had been thrown away years ago during one of Rhett's cleaning phases. I held the old trophy in my hand. The gold plating chipped and dull, the base rough and familiar. I realized that while he had returned a fragment of the past, the future was still a house I had to learn to live in alone. I stood in the lengthening shadows of my own lawn, gripping the only thing he hadn't destroyed, feeling the bite of the winter air on my face. The house was cold when I finally stepped through the front door. A shell of a life that needed a new heartbeat. But for the first time in 2 years, the air didn't taste like Benadryl and lies. I stood in the foyer, the silence no longer heavy with the threat of a looming party or the vibration of a technological predator. I had already signed a new will that morning, leaving this entire house to a local Phoenix charity for elder care. It was the final ledger entry of my independence, ensuring Rhett could never inherit the property he tried to steal. Out with the rot, in with the silence. I moved through the rooms with a box of heavy-duty trash bags, stripping the house of the Project Legacy influence, with a rhythmic clinical efficiency. I threw away the remaining ring lights, the half-empty bottles of expensive liquor, and the lingering cloying scent of Ivy's perfume. I spent an hour scrubbing the kitchen counters where the dog food bowl had sat, reclaiming the space inch by inch until the granite shone under the Arizona afternoon light streaming through the windows. Have you ever scrubbed a floor until your knuckles bled just to make sure the ghost of a person you used to love was finally gone? It is a purification that no priest could provide. I returned to my office, the air here smelling of old paper and the cedar I loved, with the faint scent of desert sage from Elena's old bowl by the window. I placed the chipped gold accounting trophy back on its rightful shelf next to the files of my real, honest clients. The weight of the property deed in my pocket no longer felt like a burden. It was a foundation. I opened my phone and deleted the surveillance app, choosing to trust my own walls again rather than digital ghosts. I sat in my leather chair and looked at the empty desk. I'm still here, Elena, I whispered. I kept the books balanced. By the time I moved to the bedroom, the house was settling into a quiet, natural rhythm, punctuated only by the distant hum of Sky Harbor flight paths overhead. Planes taking off into the Phoenix sky, carrying people toward their own destinations. I pulled back the clean, cool white sheets, a stark contrast to the stagnant bedding of my drugged months. Sleep wasn't a lapse in consciousness anymore. It was a surrender to the peace I had fought a war to earn. I fell into a deep, natural sleep and dreamed of Elena. She was standing in her desert garden beneath the shadow of Camelback Mountain, looking at the restored stone altar where the flowers were in full, vibrant bloom. Barrel cactus, desert marigolds, and the ocotillo she loved. She didn't speak, but she smiled at me with a warmth that traveled through the years. She handed me a fresh unchipped ledger, signaling that my debt to the past was finally settled. But in the dream, her smile shifted. She wasn't just looking at me. She was pointing with a gentle hand to a hidden compartment in my desk, a space I had never found in 40 years. She wanted me to see the letter she had written for this exact moment. I woke up with the sun hitting the pillow, the dream of Elena still warm in my chest, and a sudden sharp memory of the desk drawer she had pointed to. The future was still a house I had to learn to live in alone. But for the first time, I had the key. The morning air was crisp, tasting of autumn and the absence of tension as I stepped onto my porch to reclaim the sidewalk from the junk Rhett had deemed beneath him. I moved with a deliberate pace, my joints feeling the cold bite of the late November wind, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I began sorting through the trash piles left at the curb, the rough texture of cardboard trash boxes scraping against my palms. I found a discarded project legacy planner, its pages filled with the scribbled logistics of my own eraser, and tossed it into the bin with a sense of finality. As I worked, I felt the eyes of the neighborhood on me. In the past, that familiar suburban weight felt like judgment, but today it felt like a quiet curiosity. "I'm not hiding anymore," I whispered to the empty street. "This is my curb." It was then that I noticed Arthur Henderson crossing the property line. Arthur Henderson, a retired high school principal with a voice like gravel and a heart like a fortress, had lived next door since before Rhett was born. He held 2 cups of dark roast coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the cold air. He also told me that he had been holding onto my lawnmower. Rhett had tried to sell it to a stranger on the street months ago, and Arthur had bought it back just to keep it safe for me. "Silas, we saw those people," Arthur said, his steady age-spotted hands offering me a cup. "We saw the parties. We saw how you looked when you came to the mailbox. We knew something was wrong. You knew I asked." The vulnerable shock of his words hit me harder than the cold. I thought I was doing such a good job of pretending. I thought I was invisible. How many times had I walked to the mailbox with my head down, unaware that the people behind the curtains were actually cheering for my survival? Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the quiet street. "We discussed calling the police several times, Silas, but we feared we would be overstepping. We didn't want to make it worse for you if you weren't ready to push back. Before I tell you the detail that proves I was never truly alone in this fight, are you still with me? Comment A if you think neighbors should always intervene, or B if privacy is more important, and add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. The coffee was hot. The truth was hotter. I wasn't the town ghost. I was the town survivor." Arthur explained that the neighborhood association had actually started a log of the Project Legacy license plates. They had been standing guard in the shadows the whole time. Arthur even revealed that Ivy had tried to recruit his teenage granddaughter to intern for her fake brand. And the neighborhood had collectively warned the family away from the Vance's toxic visitors. "We were just waiting for you to signal for the cavalry, Silas," he said with a small supportive smile. I didn't think I had a cavalry left. I admitted feeling the first real warmth of belonging in years. As Arthur walked back to his house, he pointed toward my porch and said, "You should check the mail slot, Silas. Something came for you that isn't a bill." The brass flap of the mail slot was cold to the touch as I reached for the thick cream-colored envelope, waiting inside a piece of correspondence that would transform my private war into a public mission. I carried it into my Phoenix office, the smell of old paper and the cedar of my desk welcoming me back to a room that finally belonged to me again beneath the Arizona sun streaming through the window. I opened the envelope to find a letter from the Arizona Department of Economic Security's Adult Protective Services Division. They had received multiple reports about elder abuse cases similar to mine in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to share my forensic documentation methods with their investigators. The letter was a revelation that my experience wasn't isolated to the Arcadia neighborhood. The caseworker, Maria Gonzalez, wrote that they were seeing a disturbing pattern of adult children using over-the-counter sleep medications like Benadryl to chemically subdue elderly parents in preparation for fraudulent guardianship petitions, under Arizona law. She mentioned that my case, which had been flagged by my attorney, Aurelia Prescott, represented one of the most thoroughly documented examples of financial elder abuse they had encountered in Maricopa County. But what made my blood run cold was the next paragraph. Maria wrote that in 14 other cases across Arizona and Nevada, investigators had found the exact same digital folder structure on the perpetrators' computers. A folder labeled Project Legacy containing identical templates for disability petitions, liquidation spreadsheets, and even the same password pattern, deceased spouse's birth date. Someone was sharing this blueprint, she wrote. We believe there's an online community, possibly on encrypted forums or dark web marketplaces, where adult children are trading tactics for financially exploiting their aging parents. Your son's folder matches the template we've seen in Scottsdale, Tucson, Mesa, and even 2 cases in Las Vegas. She knew, I whispered to the desert silence filtering through my window. The system knew this was happening, but they didn't have the tools to prove it until I documented every single step. It wasn't just my battle to win. It was a blueprint others needed to survive, and apparently a blueprint predators were using to destroy families across the Southwest. I felt a sense of purpose crystallize in that quiet Phoenix office, a calling that transcended my personal grief over Elena's desecrated memorial and my son's betrayal. The woman I loved would have wanted me to turn this pain into protection for others facing the same predatory schemes across the Valley of the Sun. I sat in my leather chair feeling intellectually sharp for the first time since the Benadryl fog lifted and opened a new file on my laptop. I titled it A Guide for the Hunted, Surviving Financial Parasites. I began documenting the signs of the Project Legacy trap with the same forensic precision I had once used to audit Fortune 500 companies. The first sign isn't a missing check. I typed the rhythmic tapping of the keys, a new kind of heartbeat for the house echoing through the Arcadia quiet. It's the way they look at your $650,000 home like it's already theirs. It's the herbal tea that makes you sleep 12 hours. It's the memorial party they throw on the anniversary of your spouse's death. It's the folder on their computer with a name that sounds like inheritance planning, but reads like a hostage manual. I realized my survival wasn't just a personal victory. It was a forensic accounting manual for others who were being erased by the people they raised. Particularly in Arizona, where lax telehealth prescribing laws made chemical elder abuse dangerously easy. Is it possible for a digital document to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories? I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for every widow in Sun City, every grieving father in Tempe, every aging accountant in Scottsdale who woke up one day to find their children had turned inheritance into a hostile takeover using a template downloaded from the darkest corners of the internet. The Phoenix summer hit 108 degrees on June 15, 2025. But inside my air-conditioned office in the Arcadia house, I sat at my desk reviewing a ledger that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. 6 payments, $4,920. 174 payments remaining. I opened the small leather notebook where I had been tracking Rhett's restitution payments with the same forensic precision I once used to audit corporate fraud. Each entry was methodical. January 1st, 2025, $820 received, confirmed via ACH transfer memo line. Payment 1 of $180. February 1st, 2025, $820 received 2 days early. March 1st, 2025, $820 received on time. April 1st, 2025, $820 received on time. May 1st, 2025, $820 received on time. June 1st, 2025, $820 received on time with a brief note attached, working warehouse job in Tempe, staying clean. The pattern was undeniable. And for a forensic accountant, patterns tell stories that words cannot. My son, who had spent years living on stolen credit and Benadryl-induced fog, was now living on a budget tighter than anything I had endured during my own graduate school days in the Arizona heat. I pulled up my monitoring dashboard, not to spy, but to verify the legitimacy of his income sources, as the restitution agreement legally permitted. Rhett was working 40-hour weeks at a distribution center in Tempe, earning $16 per hour, which translated to roughly $2,500 per month after Arizona state taxes. After paying me $820, his rent of $700 for a studio apartment near Arizona State University and basic utilities, he had less than $600 per month for food, transportation, and life. He was living exactly as I had lived while he drained my accounts. He was finally learning the weight of a dollar in the desert economy. I leaned back in my leather chair, the cool air from the ceiling fan washing over me as I considered the most unsettling question of this 6-month review. Was I watching accountability or simply waiting for the inevitable collapse? The guidance counselor at the North Phoenix Senior Center, where I had been volunteering, asked me that same question 2 weeks ago after I gave a presentation on financial elder abuse to a room of 70 anxious retirees. "Mr. Vance," she had said, her voice gentle but probing, "are you helping your son rebuild, or are you just monitoring his struggle?" The question haunted me through the desert nights. I didn't have a clear answer. What I did have were 6 months of data, and data doesn't lie. Rhett hadn't missed a single payment. He hadn't tried to contact me directly except through the brief notes in the payment memos. He hadn't posted on social media. He hadn't tried to leverage Elena's memory or my reputation. The influencer persona had been completely dismantled, replaced by a man I no longer recognized. A man who clocked in, clocked out, and apparently spent his evenings in a Phoenix public library studying for a bookkeeping certification exam. I discovered this last detail not through surveillance, but through a chance encounter with Bianca, Ivy's sister, who had seen him there while tutoring high school students. "He's trying, Silas," she had told me over coffee at a Scottsdale cafe. "I don't know if it's genuine or just survival, but he's trying." I closed the notebook and looked out at Elena's desert garden, now in full summer bloom, thanks to the drip irrigation system I had finally repaired. The Ocotillo reached toward the relentless Arizona sun, resilient and defiant. 6 months wasn't redemption. It was just the first chapter of a 15-year sentence. Time is the only ledger that never lies. And as the frost of a new November settled over the Phoenix metro area, a rare desert cold snap that dropped temperatures to 48 degrees, I realized I was no longer counting the days I had lost, but the peace I had finally earned. I moved through my morning routine with a quiet, practiced precision that would have been impossible a year ago. The Arcadia house felt warm and solid around me. No longer a battleground, but a home. I had been secretly monitoring Rhett's credit score over the past 12 months. And for the first time in his life, it was climbing. It wasn't through high-stakes fraud or influencer posturing, but through the honest, boring utility payments of a man finally living within his means in the Arizona heat. I drove through the familiar streets of Phoenix, passing the houses of neighbors who now waved with genuine recognition rather than the pitting stares of the past. 1 year, the books aren't just balanced, they're blooming. I arrived at the cemetery in the East Valley. The rhythmic crunch of gravel under my boots, the only sound in the crisp morning air. Desert headstones glinted in the pale sun like polished copper scattered across the tan grass. When I reached Elena's grave, I stopped short. Resting against the cold stone was a fresh bouquet of white lilies, their petals pristine against the granite. The scent of cold earth and damp lilies rose to meet me in the dry Phoenix air. I realized then that Rhett must have been here at dawn before his warehouse shift started. For the first time, he hadn't used her memory as a weapon or a prop for a camera. He had simply honored her on the 7th anniversary of her death. Can a $147,650 debt actually be a gift? When it's the only thing tethering a drifter to the earth, the answer is yes. It was the gravity he needed to stop floating away into a life of fiction. White lilies, no cameras, no Instagram, just a son and his mother in the Arizona desert silence. I stood there for a long time, not feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, but a dull, hopeful ache. "You finally brought her the right flowers, Rhett," I whispered to the desert wind. I felt a sense of closure that no court order could provide. Back in my car, the engine idling with a soft vibration in the quiet cemetery lot, I saw a notification on my phone. I opened the email from the Restitution portal. It was the 12th payment, $820 exactly, but attached was a personal message, the longest he had written since the agreement began. "Dad," it began. "I'm not writing this to ask for a break. I'm writing this because I actually finished the month without lying to anyone, and that's a first in years." He described his modest Tempe apartment and his work at the distribution center, admitting that the debt was the only thing that felt real in his world anymore. He even mentioned meeting with Bianca to return a small heirloom. He had found one of Elena's recipe cards, a quiet attempt to mend the community he had scorched. "I'm taking a bookkeeping course at Phoenix College at night," he wrote. "I thought maybe if I understood numbers the way you do, I'd understand why I let everything fall apart. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking if you're still reading these." The cursor blinked. I had one final task to complete before the anniversary was over. The Phoenix spring brought temperatures back into the comfortable 70s, and the invitation I sent on March 10, 2026, wasn't for a home-cooked meal. It was for a small table at a busy Starbucks in Central Phoenix, a neutral ground where the history of our war couldn't swallow the air. I arrived 10 minutes early, securing a corner table that allowed me to monitor the entrance. The shop was a chaos of hissing milk wands, burnt espresso, and the sharp scent of generic cleaning spray. When Rhett walked through the door at exactly 2 p.m., I performed a silent audit. The designer jacket was gone, replaced by a plain navy polo shirt with a warehouse logo. The arrogance in his stride had been corrected into a cautious, weary posture. I noticed a glint from his phone as he set it on the laminate table. The wallpaper was a photo of Max, the family dog he had once neglected and used as a prop in his schemes. It suggested a genuine connection to the things he had claimed to lose. "You look healthy, Dad," he said, sitting across from me in the Arizona afternoon light. His hands were rough and work calloused, a far cry from the manicured influencer I'd evicted 15 months ago. "I am healthy, Rhett," I replied. "For the first time, I think we both are." He didn't lead with a pitch or a grievance. He just sat in the noise of the Phoenix coffee shop waiting for me to speak. "How do you build a bridge out of 180 monthly payments and the ghost of a mother's smile?" 15 months. 15 payments. 165 to go. I told him that while I appreciated the lilies at the cemetery and the punctuality of his 15 payments totaling $12,300, the Arcadia house remained off limits. The financial restitution was non-negotiable. We were no longer father and dependent. We were two men bound by a legal contract of atonement under Arizona law. "I'm not looking for a place to stay, Dad," he said, his voice quiet against the coffee shop noise. "I just wanted you to know I'm still working. I'm still here. I passed the bookkeeping certification exam last week." "Good," I said. "That is the only way this works. We communicate through the ledger and the occasional neutral meeting." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small paper-wrapped parcel. "It's a book on the history of forensic accounting I found at Changing Hands bookstore in Tempe," he said, sliding it across the cold, smooth surface of the table. "I thought you might like it." The title was visible through the thin wrapping, "Where the Money Goes, The True Story of Accounting Fraud." I looked at the gift and considered it carefully, the Phoenix afternoon sun streaming through the window. "Maybe next year," I said. But I didn't push it back across the table. I left it there, a symbolic middle ground. For now, just keep the payments on time and keep learning. No hug, no handshake, just a receipt for 2 lattes and a future that wasn't for sale yet. I stood up, the vibration of the coffee shop door chime echoing in my ears as I exited into the warm March afternoon. I walked to my car, feeling the weight of the house keys in my pocket. As I pulled away, I realized Rhett didn't have a car. He was standing at the Valley Metro Light rail station across the street. I watched him through the window, a solitary figure waiting for public transportation in the Phoenix heat. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to look away. The Phoenix house was quiet on the evening of March 15, 2026, but it was the rich, peaceful silence of a sanctuary rather than the hollow void of a tomb. As I stepped through the front door after my meeting with Rhett, the cool air carried the scent of late spring desert blooms and the lemon wax I'd used to polish the foyer. I sat at my clean desk and reached for the hidden compartment Elena had pointed to in a dream so vivid. I could still smell the jasmine from her favorite perfume. The drawer glided open as if it had been waiting for my touch for 7.5 years. Inside, I found a sealed envelope addressed in Elena's handwriting, "To Silus, when the house is finally yours again." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The letter was dated October 28, 2018, just 18 days before the cancer took her. She had foreseen everything. Silus, my love, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means you survived what I feared most. It means Rhett pushed you far enough that you finally pushed back. I know you're blaming yourself right now. I know you think you failed me by not saving our son from himself. But listen to me. You didn't fail. I failed to see it sooner. I saw the entitlement growing in him like a weed in my garden. And I watered it with excuses because I was dying and wanted him to remember me as the mother who always believed in him. But believing in someone doesn't mean ignoring what they're becoming. The letter went on for 3 pages detailing observations Elena had made in her final months, Rhett's increasing interest in the house's value, his questions about inheritance laws, the way he looked at her jewelry with appraising eyes rather than sentimental ones. She had even documented a conversation where he asked her about dementia symptoms, claiming it was for a school project, even though he'd been out of school for 6 years. She knew, I whispered. She knew he would try to drug me. She knew he would try to take everything. The final paragraph was instructions for a ceremony. Silus, when you read this, I want you to go to my grave at sunset. Read this letter out loud to me. Then burn it and scatter the ashes in the desert wind. Not because I want you to forget, but because I want you to be free from the guilt of the promise I extracted from you in that hospital room. You kept your promise by saving yourself. Now I'm releasing you from it. Love always, your Elena. I looked at the clock. It was 5:47 p.m. Sunset was at 6:23 p.m. I had 36 minutes. I drove to the East Valley Cemetery, Elena's letter pressed against my chest. The desert sky was turning shades of copper and gold as I knelt beside her headstone. I read the letter out loud, my voice carrying across the empty cemetery. When I finished, I pulled out a small lighter and touched the flame to the corner of the page. The paper caught quickly in the dry climate, and I held it until the heat forced me to drop it into a ceramic bowl I'd brought from home. The ashes swirled in the evening breeze, lifting toward Camelback Mountain. As the last ember died, I felt something shift. Not grief, but release. Elena had given me permission to stop carrying the weight of her final wish. I stood and placed my hand on the cold granite. Thank you, Elena, I whispered. For seeing what I couldn't, for preparing me, for letting me go. The sun dipped below the horizon. I walked back to my car and drove home to the Arcadia house that was finally completely mine. When I look back at everything that happened, I realized this was never just about money, inheritance, or a house in Phoenix. It was a painful mirror, showing me the mistakes I made as a father and as a man. This family story forced me to admit that love without boundaries can quietly turn into permission for betrayal. For years, I believed patience and sacrifice would eventually fix everything. But silence only allowed the damage to grow. If there is one lesson in this family story, it is this: do not ignore the warning signs simply because the person hurting you shares your blood. Some people online might call what happened a dad revenge. But that description is too simple. My dad revenge was never about destroying my son. It was about protecting my life, my dignity, and the memory of the woman I loved. Sometimes the hardest truth in any family story is realizing that accountability is the only language some people understand. Without consequences, love becomes weakness. With boundaries, even a painful dad revenge can become the beginning of responsibility. If you are listening to this family story, please do not repeat my mistake. Speak up sooner. Protect your peace before someone else decides to take it from you. I believe that even in the darkest moments, God can guide us toward clarity and justice if we are willing to face the truth. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I would truly like to hear your perspective. What would you have done if you were in Silas's position facing that betrayal? Please share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A quick note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world themes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.